William J. Federer is a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and the founder of AmericanMinute.com. Bill is dedicated to researching and uncovering America's foundation of faith in Christ. His new project, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, we're here to talk about. Bill, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here with us.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Don.
The Quran is the Bible for the Islam faith. Is that safe to say?
Yes. It's interesting that Muhammad was illiterate, so he didn't actually write it. He had went out to a cave in 610 AD is when he began his faith, and he got verses from his Allah, and he tells the story of a spirit that squeezed him and commanded him to read. And he said, I cannot read. The spirit squeezed him again, said, read. He said, I cannot read. It happened a third time. Finally, the spirit threw him down and he began to recite. And that's how the Quran came to Muhammad. He'd get these verses in his mind, he'd repeat them until he has them memorized, teach them to his followers. Some have used the similarity of like Joseph Smith, but someone may think, well, how can somebody that's illiterate memorize all these long verses? In Arabic, they had a little rhyme to them, a little beat, very similar to like rap music today, where maybe a student can't read, but they memorize these long rap songs. And so he would teach these to his followers. And it was not until Caliph Uthman came along did they actually get written down.
How important is the Quran to Islam, to a Muslim, to a follower of Muhammad?
Well, there's four things that make up Sharia law. One is the Quran, private revelations to Muhammad, and they come in two different kinds of verses. The verses given to Muhammad in Mecca, when he was just a religious leader, are relatively more peaceful. The verses he gets in Medina are political military verses, and they're more violent. And the later verses supersede and erase the earlier verses. By way of comparison, in the Old Testament, we have some violence. New Testament, Jesus and the apostles didn't kill anybody. We say the later example is what we're going to follow. It's the same way in Islam, only in reverse. Their peaceful verses came first when he was in Mecca, and they're superseded by the strong verses that come in Medina. The second source of Sharia law is the hadiths. These are stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. He had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, and he had lots of warriors that fought with him. And their sayings of, I remember the prophet did this or that, are written down. Then there's the Sirat, which is the biography of Muhammad, written 100 years after his death. And then there's the 1,400 years of interpretations by Muslim scholars. All that together equals the religion of Islam.
And Islam is growing. It's the second largest religion in the world. We've got a little piece that we've put together that kind of overviews that. Let's take a look at it.
The news is full of headlines depicting horrific human rights violations at the hands of radical Muslims. But why the violence from a religion that's supposed to promote peace? While there are many peaceful Muslims, the Quran specifically instructs loyal followers to fight, make war against, and kill non-believers if they are unwilling to convert to Islam. Islam teaches violence and treachery as principles of the faith, while Christianity teaches us to love our enemies and turn the other cheek. The fundamental teachings of the Quran do not advocate peace, but cruelty. The world yearns for a peaceful coexistence, but peace for the radical Muslim comes only when the entire world has converted to Islam. The extremist followers will not stop until their mission is complete.
Bill, I see the ISIS all the time is in the headlines. Every time you turn on ISIS, and ISIS is doing this, ISIS is doing that. Can you give us a little bit of a tracing of the roots of ISIS?
Well, definitely, and that's sort of what's in the book. But ISIS is the Islamic State. And so the Islamic State goes all the way back to Muhammad. And Muhammad's interesting life in the fact that he was a religious leader first, then he became a political and a military leader. As a religious leader, he had his father die before he was born. His mother died when he was 6 years old. His grandfather and guardian died when he was 8 years old. So he was orphaned and taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who was a merchant, who would take Muhammad on camel rides to different cities, and they would hear different religions. And so they would go to Mecca, which was a pagan city. In Arabia, they had 360 different pagan gods. The most popular god in each town was the Allah for that town. Well, Mecca's most favorite god was Hubal, the moon god, and they had their calendar began with the first sight of the crescent moon over the desert, and they would have this rock that they would kiss and walk around, and they did this for centuries. And so Muhammad was made familiar with this. And then the Zoroastrians were Persians, And they believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all the guy's desires. And Muhammad heard that. And then there was the Jewish faith. And even Encyclopedia Britannica stated that the gospel was made known to Muhammad through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. And his only exposure to Christianity was through these heresies, Arianism and Ebionism and so forth. Now, Muhammad never read the Old Testament because he was illiterate. But he heard their oral stories called Talmud and Mishnah, and some of those stories got it reflected in his belief system. So, in a sense, he thought that there was something that would attract everyone to join his faith. When he goes into Mecca, he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And the Meccans consider him as a disturber of the peace, and so they chase Muhammad out of town in the year 622 AD. He goes north to Medina, and that's when the Jews let him in because it's a Jewish city. The Jews reject his faith, but they let him stay, and he goes as a religious immigrant, as a refugee, into the minority neighborhoods. He begins to organize a following, and then he goes back to the Jewish leaders. They make a treaty. Now he's a political leader. And then when his followers are chased out of Mecca, he allows them to rob the caravans, and that's when he becomes a military leader.
So first he was religious. Then he was political. And then he became a military
leader. He fought in 66 battles and raids. He beheads 700 Jews in Medina. And when he dies, the rightly guided caliphs take over. They conquer Yemen, which was a Jewish kingdom. Ghassanids were Arab Christians, and they were conquered. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. It's conquered. And then the Muslims conquer Syria. People forget Syria was where the name Christian was first used. And these Syrian Christians evangelized east like the Greeks did west. So they evangelized into India. Even China during the Tang Dynasty had a thriving Syrian Christian community. There was a Muslim leader named Tamerlane that wipes out Christianity in Central Asia, leaves pyramids of skulls, kills 17 million people.
Goodness, 17 million. Let's put a timeline together for the folks at home. Jesus, somewhere in one, let's call it one Jesus, when he was born, someplace in that time period. He resurrects from the dead somewhere in the 33 AD. Where's Muhammad at in timeline?
He's born 570 AD.
570 AD.
So we're talking 500 and some odd years after Christ.
So Constantine had already declared Christianity.
The whole Roman Empire was now Christian. So all of North Africa used to be Christian. All of Egypt used to be Christian. All the Middle East was Christian. All of Turkey was the Byzantine Christian Empire.
So here comes Muhammad out, and he starts Islam, and that story is very interesting, as you said. And then that first hit 70 converts in his first 14 years. Is that what I heard you just say?
First 12 years, Muhammad only made 70 converts. And he gets confrontational, hangs around that pagan Kaaba, that square building, and tells the pagans they're going to burn in hell. And so that's when they decided to chase Muhammad out of town for disturbing the peace. Now it's interesting, Islam is a religion of peace, but their definition of the word peace is different than ours. Our definition of peace is different groups getting along. Their definition of the word peace is when the whole world submits to the will of Allah.
That's so important for us to understand that. Our peace is not the same peace that Islam would declare.
Right. And so they see the world in two halves, the half that is submitted to Allah and become Muslim, and the half that's in the process of submitting to Allah. It's called the house of war, the Dar al-Harb. Now, a moderate Muslim thinks the world's going to submit to Allah later, maybe in the distant future, maybe it's even figurative, and since it's so far in the distant future, it really doesn't concern him. The fundamental Muslim thinks the world is supposed to submit to Allah now. And so the dilemma for the West is the more the West bends over backwards in unprecedented ways to show ourselves tolerant, the more the moderate Muslim begins to rethink and says, wait a second, this has never happened before. Maybe the world is in fact submitting to Allah now rather than later. So they gravitate from the future peaceful, nonviolent camp into the fundamental now camp, which is the violent camp. And
you know, you've written a book, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran. And then you also have a DVD series that's very interesting, educational, called Islamic Conquest. And we want to offer that to our partners. For your gift to the ministry, we want you to learn. So Bill, you know, it's in the process of learning that we are able then to understand. If we don't understand what we see in the news and the history of Islam and the history of Muhammad, then we are going to believe a lie. will be subject to believe a lie.
Well, you know, you started off asking about ISIS, which is the Islamic State, and it actually happened in 3 springs. We heard the term Arab Spring.
Yeah.
The first was an Arab-Persian spring from 622 to 1071, and it went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. They captured all of Spain in 10 years. Then they conquered southern France. They were finally stopped outside of Paris at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad in 632 AD, Arabia to Paris. And then the Turks convert to Islam, and this is the second spring. The Seljuk Turks invaded into what is today Turkey, but it was the Byzantine Christian Roman Empire. And so all 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by these Muslim Turks. The Byzantine Christians beg the West for help. The West sends help. It's called the Crusades.
Oh, okay.
That's what the Crusades were. And they stopped the Muslims for 2 centuries. When the Crusades end, the Muslims pick up and they surround Constantinople in 1453 and conquer it. Now, why is this significant? In 1453, when they conquer Constantinople, it cuts off the land trade routes to get from Europe to India and China. People forget Marco Polo went from Venice, Italy to China in 1271, brought back spaghetti, charcoal, gunpowder, talked about the Chinese inventing paper out of pulp from trees and paper currency and so forth. But when the Muslims conquered Central Asia and sacked Constantinople, it cut off the land trade routes in 1453. So the Europeans began to look for a sea route, and in 1492, Columbus said, I got an idea, sail west. Columbus thought he made it to India, so he named the people he met Indians. Think of it, we never would have called Native Americans Indians if it had not been for the Islamic State, Islamic Jihad, cutting off the land routes to India and China.
Oh, that's very interesting. That's very interesting, and that's what was the motivation behind Columbus's exploration, was to find another way.
Because the Muslims cut off the land routes.
Because they cut off the land routes.
Now, it's interesting, when the Muslims were invading into what is today Turkey, the Greek scholars were fleeing west with their Greek art, architecture, and literature, and they went to Florence, Italy, and this reinterest in the 1450s of Greek stuff we call the Renaissance.
So it's embedded in all of history.
Right.
At least modern history.
And when the Greek scholars fled the Muslim invasion, they brought with them their Greek New Testaments. And so in the late 1400s is when the European scholars translated the Bible not just to Latin but to Greek.
Yeah.
This laid the foundation for the Reformation.
See how God uses it?
Yeah,
God gets under history.
So as Islam conquers from the east, civilization flees further west. So in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. In 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, he dominates the Mediterranean. Martin Luther says the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. John Calvin writes, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. John Wesley later wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations. And so what happened, the Holy Roman Emperor is Catholic Charles V of Spain. He strikes a deal with the Protestants, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, to have a united front against the Muslims. And this Peace of Augsburg had a little Latin phrase, cruios regio eius religio, which means whose is the reign, his is the religion. So in other words, believe whatever you want in your kingdom, let's just work together against this invasion. And so this births different kings in Europe believing slightly different things, with Germany being Lutheran and Switzerland being Calvinist and England being Anglican. And if you didn't believe the way your king did, you fled. And so this turned into this mass migration of people shifting around Europe for conscience sake in the 1600s. Those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America.
Wow. How in the world do you know all this stuff? How can you get all that information inside of you?
Well, it's just repetition, so there's nothing there but reading.
Oh, my. You are gifted by God to be able to understand and then be able to communicate what you've been given to share. I mean, it's so critical, Bill.
Well, a couple key battles. In 1683, 200,000 Muslims surround Vienna. The Polish king Jan Sobieski comes to Vienna's rescue on September 11th, 1683. It's the largest cavalry charge in history up to this date, 40,000 big Polish hussar horses, and the soldiers had made wings for their back. And it made this enormous flapping noise when they charged. The Muslims were so scared they dropped their weapons and fled. And when Jan Sobieski goes into the abandoned Muslim tents, he finds these bags of beans, coffee beans. Realizes this was this new Muslim drink that allowed him to fight day and night. And shortly thereafter, the Polish general, George Franz Klaszczewski, opens the first Vienna coffee house. Now, they weren't sure if they should drink coffee because it was the Muslims' drink. So they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. He tasted it, said, this is too good to leave for the Muslims. Let's baptize it. And then coffee spread across Europe. Anyway, that was the Battle of Vienna, September 11, 1680, the same year that William Penn was founding Pennsylvania.
Is that right?
1683.
Goodness.
Anyway, after that battle, it was like the Gettysburg for the Confederacy. It was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire, and they kept getting driven back. Finally, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire's gone. Muslim world viewed itself as defeated. France takes a part of it, Lebanon and Syria. Britain takes a part of it, Iraq, Egypt, Palestine. And they wanted America to take Armenia. We said no, and they killed 1.5 million Armenian Christians between 1915 and 1922. But the Ottoman Empire was gone, and they got these secular leaders that wanted to distance themselves from their fundamentalist past and be friends with the West, because we had airplanes, telephones, televisions. They had mountains of useless sand and camels. And so these kings, like the Shah of Iran, he loved America. But then the Muslim Brotherhood was started and would target these secular leaders, and we would prop them up until finally we had a political change in America. 1938, the Standard Oil Company discovered oil in Saudi Arabia, and we began to buy so much oil that Saudi Arabia went from the poorest to the richest Muslim country, and they began to use that money to finance the spread of Wahhabism and fundamental Islam. And so we see this targeting of these leaders. So Jimmy Carter pulls the rug out from the Shah of Iran, and the fundamentalist Ayatollah takes over. The Muslims take over Mubarak and take over Egypt. Mubarak's kicked out. Our president gets rid of Gaddafi in Libya, and is moving the guns from Libya through Benghazi to Turkey to arm the Muslim Brotherhood to take out Assad in Syria. When Russia comes to Syria's rescue, these Muslim Brotherhood people, armed by America, trained by Americans, go into Afghanistan and Iraq, kill the Christians, and call themselves ISIS.
Wow.
So America created ISIS. Then we rush through funding to train Muslims to fight Muslims. They get all trained and they join ISIS. We are either the most inept world superpower arming the bad guy, or this is intentional.
Nothing in history just happens. That God's hand is seen through all history. And I wonder how his hand is being, because it all works to his plan, how he's using that to form this final end age. I want you to get this for your home. You know, what every American needs to know about the Quran and Islamic conquest, so that you may understand. What Bill's talking to us about is important information for every Christian American to have a further understanding. You need to know. We need to study to show ourselves approved. So I'm going to ask you to call and make a donation to Cornerstone, and let us get this information into your hand. It's so very, very important. Such an important subject, because we see it in the news every day. And as we see it, we look at it with question marks. And if we listen to secular media, we're going to think that it is what it is not. And unless we know the truth, we can't be set free. Stay tuned. We have some further information from Bill that you don't want to miss. We'll be right back.
Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world, with over 1.3 billion people identifying as Muslim. Most Americans know very little about the Quran, who wrote it, and how Islam spread across the globe. Now is the time to get educated. William J. Federer, Islam expert and host of the American Minute, spent years researching events, documents, books, and articles to compile an objective and comprehensive look at the Muslim faith. For your gift of $30 to Cornerstone, you'll receive William J. Federer's book titled What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, and a 5-part DVD series about Islamic conquest and its unknown connection to a variety of significant events. You'll learn how Islam has affected our Western culture and the impact it could have on the future. Your life won't be the same once you've understood this powerful knowledge. Don't miss this incredible opportunity. Call 888-665-4483 and get your copies today.
Bill, the attack on New York on September 11th, I understand there's a tie-in to that date.
Well, it's interesting that in Islam, it's not a personal relationship with Allah. Matter of fact, in Islam, it's blasphemy to even want to have a personal relationship with Allah. Jesus said that we're children of God. In Islam, Allah has no children. Allah took no wife and has no son. Jesus taught that God is our Father. In Islam, it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. And so we see that it's not a personal relationship, it's a brotherhood. It's a peer pressure. And so in that sense, they lost 3 major battles on September 11th. And if you're a football team and you lose the playoffs, the only way to regain your honor is to win the playoffs. And so the first is in the year 1565. The Muslims were dominating the Mediterranean Sea, raiding entire coasts of Italy. They carried away thousands into slavery. And so there's this little island called Malta. And there's these noisome Knights of Malta, 1,000 of them, and they're really good sailors. And this is that small point in the middle of the Mediterranean. So it's wide on the west. It gets narrow where the boot of Italy and Sicily and this little island of Malta is narrow. Then it gets wide on the east. And so this Malta island controlled east and west trade. 40,000 Muslims surround the island of Malta. And the defender, his name is Jean Lavalette. He's 70 years old. He gets these Knights of Malta together and he says, okay, guys, you promised to give your life for Christ when you join this order. Guess what? You're going to have to give it here because we're probably not going to get any reinforcements. And the Muslims pound away at their fortresses, reducing them to rubbles. And then they would attack. And these guys would climb out of the rubble and fight back. And the Muslims like, oh. And then they would and then the Muslims would attack again and again. Finally, the last group of them, they blast through the wall. This elderly Jean Lavalette stands in the gap. And the Muslims see this one old guy standing there. And the young guy said, well, he's going to die. We may as well die with him. They rush out, but they don't stop at the wall. They pour out. And the Muslims are tripping over themselves backwards down the hill, and they get routed. Finally, relief troops come, and the Muslims are driven away on September 11th.
Is that right?
1565. Another battle is September 11th. In 1697, 100,000 Muslims surround Serbia, invade Serbia and into Hungary. And 30,000 of them are defeated by the Serbs and the Hungarians. Great victory, Battle of Zenta, Z-E-N-T-A, on September 11th, 1697. But the big one that we get is 1683. This is when 200,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria. This is the same year that William Penn is founding Pennsylvania. 200,000 Muslims surround Vienna. And the leader of the Muslims is Ali Pasha, and the defenders, they get the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, takes his entire Polish army and leaves the country with it and comes to Vienna's rescue on September 11th, 1683. And it's the largest cavalry charge in history up to this date, 40,000 big Polish hussar horses. The soldiers had made wings for their back. You know how soldiers will put horns on their helmet? But these wings made this enormous flapping, thunderous noise. Whoop, whoop, whoop. The Muslims drop their weapons and flee. And he's considered the savior of Western civilization. And so since they suffered these 3 major defeats on September 11th, they think, well, that's why they picked this date to restart their conquest of the West.
So that's the history behind September 11.
Right. These are major slapdowns. And so in Islam, whenever they suffer major defeats, they get peaceful until they can regroup and attack again. And so this goes back to the Muslim concept of hudna. When you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard them.
That's interesting. When you're weak, you make treaties until you get strong enough to disregard.
Right. So when Muhammad first came to the Jewish city of Medina, the Jews let him in. He goes into the minority neighborhoods and he organizes a following, goes back to the Jews. They make a treaty with him. Well, then the Meccans try to attack Muhammad because he's robbing their caravans, and Muhammad drives them away in 627 AD. And once the Meccans are driven away, Muhammad goes back into the city of Medina and chases out 2 of the Jewish tribes, breaks the treaty. The 3rd Jewish tribe, he surrounds them in their neighborhood for 25 days, and then he brings them out and beheads them, 600 or 700 of them. And so within 5 years of Muhammad coming into the Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city. So we actually see it goes through 3 stages. The first stage is Muhammad was an immigrant into this Jewish city of Medina. Second stage is Muhammad gets involved politically. Third stage, he gets involved militarily. Yeah. And so we see the Muslim immigrants come in the first stage, and they're nice, and they're so nice. People say they're nice, let more in. More come in, they gravitate together, and they form communities, and they get an imam who says, follow the Quran closer, and then begin to get politicized and demand political accommodation, like don't insult Islam. And then when people move out of the neighborhood, those that refuse to move out, that's when there's random violence, and no Muslim will testify against another Muslim on behalf of an infidel, and so they gradually take over the neighborhood. So they go from religious, political, military.
Are we seeing some of that that type of momentum happen in the United States?
Right. Hugo Chavez has been bringing Muslim terrorists over from Iran to Venezuela, teaching them Spanish, sending them north. So we've seen rising numbers of Muslims in South and Latin America, in Tobago and Suriname and Venezuela, and now they've infiltrated the drug gangs, and they've come across into all the major cities in America. And now we see the president is bringing over a large number of Muslim immigrants, 8,000 Somali Muslims being moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming and put in Section 8 housing, moving thousands of Syrian Muslims into Boise, Idaho, putting them in Section 8 housing. They're in such large groups that they'll never assimilate, and they're not doing any background checks. So there's a good chance that many of these are fundamental Muslims. The thought is, are they going to plan an Arab Spring? Simultaneous Fergusons and Baltimores all across America, maybe right before the next election. It's a very critical time for the country.
You know, it's very sobering. It's a sobering thought.
I do want to point out, though, that many Muslims are having dreams of Jesus.
Exactly.
And they're converting. I've met several of them. And they'll have a dream. One lady had a dream of a stained glass window with gold rings, and she saw Jesus come up and take the rings off the window and put one on her finger. And she says, I felt it. And I woke up the next day. I didn't want it to fall off. And she said, I didn't know. I just knew there was something special about Jesus. Another ministry, ChristForAllPeoples.org,
yes,
gives out the DVD, the Jesus film, in 16 different Muslim languages, and they pass it out. And millions of Muslims are coming to Christ just by watching the movie of Jesus. So when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord raises up a standard.
Hallelujah. And that's how we're going to close this program. Know this, God is in control. Bill, thank you for coming and opening our eyes to the history. We learn from history, and I'm thankful that you were able to tune in and watch the program with us. Get a copy, What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, and also the Islamic Conquest by making a contribution to Cornerstone. We know God is in control. We want to thank you, brother. God bless you.
Thank you.
Islam is one of the fastest growing religions in the world, with over 1.3 billion people identifying as Muslim. Most Americans know very little about the Quran, who wrote it, and how Islam spread across the globe. Now is the time to get educated. William J. Federer, Islam expert and host of the American Minute, spent years researching events, documents, books, and articles to compile an objective and comprehensive look at the Muslim faith. For your gift of $30 to Cornerstone, you'll receive William J. Federer's book titled What Every American Needs to Know About the Quran, and a 5-part DVD series about Islamic conquest and its unknown connection to a variety of significant events. You'll learn how Islam has affected our Western culture and the impact it could have on the future. Your life won't be the same once you've understood this powerful knowledge. Don't miss this incredible opportunity. Call 888-665-4483 and get your copies today.